Ava Monroe slammed her foot on the brake as the sleek black car came to an abrupt halt at the entrance of her estate. The ornate iron gate stood tall before her, unmoving. Impatience simmered in her chest as she glanced at her watch, the expensive timepiece reflecting the afternoon sun. She was already late for a gala, and the last thing she needed was a delay. She honked her horn twice, sharply, but the gatekeeper, an older black man standing at the security booth, didn't rush. He took his time, walking slowly toward her car. His calm demeanor only fueled her frustration. Rolling down the window, she glared at him. "What's the holdup? Open the gate, Jeremiah. I don't have all day." Jeremiah's face remained impassive as he reached the driver's side. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Monroe," he said, his voice steady and measured. "There's been a small issue with the security system. I'm working on it, but it might take a minute." Ava rolled her eyes. "A minute? Do you realize who I am? I don't care about your system, just open the gate." Jeremiah didn't flinch. "I'm afraid I can't do that until the system resets, ma'am. It's protocol." The final thread of Ava's patience snapped. Without thinking, she leaned out of the car and slapped Jeremiah hard across the face. The sound echoed in the quiet of the afternoon, the force of it shocking both of them. For a moment there was silence. Jeremiah raised a hand to his cheek, his expression unchanged, but something flickered in his eyes. He met Ava's gaze, his voice calm and composed. "You'll regret this, Mrs. Monroe. You have no idea who I am." Ava blinked, the weight of his words sinking in, but she dismissed it just as quickly. "Don't be dramatic," she muttered, speeding off the moment the gate finally creaked open. But as the car disappeared down the driveway, a sense of unease settled in the pit of her stomach. There was something in Jeremiah's voice, something she couldn't shake. What did he mean by those words? The uneasy feeling lingered with Ava throughout the evening. As she stood amidst glittering chandeliers and elegant guests at the gala, her thoughts kept drifting back to Jeremiah's parting words. "You'll regret this, Mrs. Monroe. You have no idea who I am." What had he meant? She tried to brush it off, convincing herself that it was nothing more than an empty threat. He was just a gatekeeper, after all. Why should she waste her time thinking about him? Yet, no matter how many times she told herself that, the unease remained. Back at home later that night, she pulled up to the estate, half expecting Jeremiah to still be standing at the gate, his calm eyes following her car. But the gate was open, and the security booth empty. For a fleeting moment, she considered calling someone to ask where he was, but pride held her back. Ava Monroe wasn't the type to worry about employees. The next morning, she awoke early. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the estate was quiet. The perfect time for a walk. As she strolled through her lavish gardens, taking in the meticulously maintained landscape, she noticed something odd. A group of workers stood near a section of the estate she rarely visited, a large, unused wing that had fallen into disrepair over the years. Normally, she would have passed them by without a second glance, but today, curiosity got the better of her. After all, this was her estate. What could they possibly be doing there? Ava approached the workers, her heels clicking against the stone path. "What's going on here?" One of the men, looking nervous, glanced up at her. Ma'am, we're just clearing this area out. Mr. Brooks gave the orders." "Mr. Brooks?" Ava's brow furrowed. "Who is Mr. Brooks?" The man hesitated. "Jeremiah Brooks, ma'am. He told us to start clearing the debris and preparing for renovations." Ava's confusion deepened. "Jeremiah? He's the gatekeeper. What gives him the authority to order renovations on my property?" The worker looked uncomfortable. I don't know the details, ma'am. I'm just following instructions." Without another word, Ava turned on her heel and headed back toward the main house, her mind racing. Jeremiah Brooks. She had always known him simply as Jeremiah, the quiet, unassuming gatekeeper who barely spoke unless spoken to. Yet, suddenly, he was ordering renovations on her property. She decided to confront him directly. When she reached the gatehouse, she found Jeremiah there, as calm and composed as ever. He was reading something, a stack of papers from the looks of it. Ava stormed toward him, her temper flaring. "What the hell is going on, Jeremiah?" she snapped. "Why are you ordering workers around on my estate?" Jeremiah looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. He folded the papers and stood, meeting her gaze. "Good morning, Mrs. Monroe. I assume you're referring to the renovations near the old wing?" "Obviously," she snapped. "You're the gatekeeper. You have no right to make decisions about my property." Jeremiah's eyes never left hers. "Actually, Mrs. Monroe, I have more of a right than you think." Ava crossed her arms, glaring at him. "I want an explanation. Now." Jeremiah stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "I think it's time we had a conversation about the true ownership of this estate." Her heart skipped a beat, but she quickly masked her surprise. "What are you talking about?" Jeremiah's gaze didn't waver. "This estate isn't as entirely yours as you believe. The Brooks family has a history here, one that stretches back long before you or Charles ever set foot on this land." For a moment, Ava was speechless. The audacity of his words stunned her. "You're lying. This estate belonged to Charles and his family for generations." Jeremiah shook his head. "No, that's what you were led to believe. But there are records, legal documents, that tell a different story." Ava felt her pulse quicken. Legal documents? How could that be possible? Before she could respond, Jeremiah handed her a folded piece of paper. "I suggest you read this carefully, Mrs. Monroe. It might change everything you think you know about this estate." The paper felt heavy in Ava's hand, even though it was just a single, neatly folded document. She stared at it, her mind racing with questions. Jeremiah stood quietly, waiting, his calm demeanor only adding to the weight of the moment. Finally, she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the page. It was an old legal document, the kind with yellowed edges and typewritten text. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the words. Brooks Family Deed, Original Land Ownership and Entitlements. Ava blinked in disbelief. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of mistake. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking slightly. Jeremiah didn't flinch. "That document outlines the original ownership of this land. The Brooks family owned this estate long before the Monroes ever set foot on it. Through a series of legal manipulations, the land was taken from my ancestors and claimed by your husband's family." Ava's mind spun as she processed his words. "You're saying my husband, Charles, knew about this?" Jeremiah's expression softened slightly. "Charles and I were working together to make things right. He was planning to return a portion of the estate to the Brooks family. But his death, well, things didn't go as planned." Ava felt the ground shift beneath her. Charles had never mentioned any of this, not once. She had been married to him for years, and yet he had kept this enormous secret from her. "I don't believe this," she said, shaking her head. "Charles wouldn't have lied to me like this." Jeremiah's gaze softened. "I'm not asking you to believe me right away, Mrs. Monroe, but I think you owe it to yourself, and to Charles, to look into this. There are more documents, more evidence. It's all there, waiting for you to find it." Ava's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't want to believe Jeremiah's words, but something deep inside her told her that he was telling the truth. If Charles had hidden this from her, what else had he kept secret? Determined to uncover the truth, Ava turned on her heel and marched back to the house. She needed answers, and she would stop at nothing to find them. Ava spent the next several days locked in her husband's old study, going through every file, every document, every scrap of paper she could find. The more she searched, the more she realized that Jeremiah hadn't been lying. There were old contracts, deeds, and letters, each one pointing to the same shocking truth. The Brooks family had once owned this land. Her hands trembled as she uncovered more evidence, each piece fitting together like a puzzle she hadn't even known existed. How had she been so blind? How had Charles kept this from her? The final blow came when she found an old letter from Charles to Jeremiah, dated just a few months before his death. In it, Charles apologized for the wrongs his family had done to the Brooks family and promised to make amends. Ava's heart sank as she read the words. Charles had planned to return the land to Jeremiah's family. He had known all along. He had just never told her. By the time she finished reading, Ava was numb. The truth had been staring her in the face, and she had refused to see it. She stormed back to the gatehouse, clutching the letter in her hand. Jeremiah was there, as always, calm and composed. "You were right," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Charles knew. He planned to give the land back to your family." Jeremiah nodded, his expression unreadable. "I told you, Mrs. Monroe, this estate has a long and complicated history." Ava felt a surge of anger rise within her. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why didn't you confront me when Charles died?" Jeremiah met her gaze calmly. "Because it wasn't my place. I wanted you to come to the truth on your own terms. But now that you know, we have decisions to make." Ava stared at him, her heart pounding. Decisions? What did he mean by that? Before she could ask, Jeremiah said quietly, "You can either fight to keep this estate, or work with me to make things right. The choice is yours." Ava stood frozen, Jeremiah's words echoing in her mind. "You can either fight to keep this estate, or work with me to make things right. The choice is yours." What did it even mean to make things right? For her entire adult life, this estate had been her home, her sanctuary. And now, Jeremiah was telling her that her claim to it wasn't as solid as she'd always believed. The weight of Charles' betrayal, or omission rather, was heavier than she could bear. "I need more answers," she finally said, her voice a mix of frustration and desperation. "Tell me everything about the Brooks family and this estate. I want the full story." Jeremiah's expression softened as he leaned back, crossing his arms thoughtfully. "I thought you might ask that. Come with me." He led her into the old wing of the estate, the one that had been left unused and in disrepair for years. It was a part of the estate Ava rarely visited, its cobwebbed halls and creaky floors a reminder of the grandeur that had once been. But Jeremiah moved through it with familiarity, as if every inch of the space meant something to him. Finally, they arrived at a small, dusty room at the far end of the wing. Jeremiah pulled out a key and unlocked a door Ava hadn't even known existed. Inside was a study, not unlike the one Charles had used, but much older, with antique furnishings and bookshelves lining the walls. Jeremiah gestured for her to sit at a large oak desk, then opened one of the drawers and pulled out an old leather-bound book. "This," he said, "is the history of my family and this estate." Ava leaned in, her heart pounding as she watched him open the book to a faded, handwritten page. "The Brooks family has been connected to this land for generations," Jeremiah began. "Long before the Monroes came into the picture, my great-grandparents owned this property. It was a working farm back then, modest but successful. My ancestors built this land from the ground up, only to have it taken from them when they couldn't pay back loans during the Great Depression." Ava felt a chill run down her spine. She'd always known the estate had a history, but not this history. Jeremiah continued, his voice steady. "Charles' grandfather was one of the men who offered to help my family during that time. But instead of helping, he manipulated the terms of the loan, forcing my family to sign over the land when they couldn't meet the impossible conditions." Ava's chest tightened. But that was a long time ago. Surely Charles didn't know about all of this." "Oh, he knew?" Jeremiah said quietly. "He didn't want to believe it at first, but when he saw the documents, just like the ones you found, he knew the truth, and he wanted to make it right." Ava's mind raced. Charles had known? He had intended to give the land back? Why had he kept her in the dark? Before she could speak, Jeremiah added, "But it wasn't just about giving the land back. There's more to this story, much more." Jeremiah turned to the next page in the book where a family tree was drawn in elegant ink. "There's something you need to know about Charles, and about me." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Ava stared at Jeremiah, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean? What else is there to know about Charles?" Jeremiah's calm, measured tone remained as he continued. "Charles and I weren't just friends, Mrs. Monroe. We were family." Ava blinked, her mind struggling to process the revelation. "Family? How is that possible? Charles never mentioned you as family." Jeremiah sighed, clearly anticipating her disbelief. Because he didn't know the full truth until later in his life. We shared a grandfather. Your husband and I were half-brothers. Ava felt the world tilt beneath her. That's impossible, she whispered, shaking her head. You're saying Charles's father? Jeremiah nodded. Charles's father had a relationship with my grandmother, long before he married Charles's mother. That relationship was hidden from the world, and my grandmother was left behind when the Monroe family rose in wealth and status, but the Brooks family always knew. The room felt suddenly too small, the walls closing in as the weight of the revelation settled on Ava's shoulders. She had lived her entire life believing that she knew everything about Charles, about their family, about their legacy, and now she was discovering that her entire world had been built on a lie. How did Charles find out? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jeremiah looked down at the old book, running his fingers over the pages as though remembering a distant memory. He found out when he stumbled upon the same documents you did. He came to me, not knowing how to handle it. At first he was angry at his father, angry at the situation. But over time, he began to see it differently. He realized that our connection, our family's connection, was something worth preserving, not hiding. Ava's heart pounded in her chest. So that's why he wanted to give the estate back? He wanted to restore the Brooks family's legacy? Jeremiah nodded. Yes, he knew it was the right thing to do, but he didn't want to hurt you in the process. He thought he had more time to tell you, to explain everything. But when he died suddenly, the plans were left unfinished. Ava's mind raced, her emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. She didn't know whether to feel betrayed, angry, or heartbroken. Charles had kept so many secrets from her, secrets that could have changed everything. And yet, he had been trying to do the right thing. He had been trying to build a bridge between the two families. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. Now wasn't the time for tears. Now was the time for action. She turned to Jeremiah, her voice steady. What do we do now? Jeremiah closed the book and met her gaze. Now, we finish what Charles started. We bring the truth to light, and we make things right. Ava nodded, determination hardening her heart. But as she stood to leave, Jeremiah's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. What is it? Ava asked, her heart skipping a beat. Jeremiah looked up, his expression grim. There's someone else, someone who's been watching this estate for a long time, and they're not going to let us finish this easily. The tension between Ava and Jeremiah had shifted. Where there had once been mistrust, there was now a shared purpose. But the revelation that someone else was involved, a mysterious rival with an interest in the estate, brought a new layer of danger. As they left the dusty study, Jeremiah explained the situation further. For years, another branch of the Brooks family has been trying to reclaim this estate. They've remained in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Ava frowned. Another branch? Why haven't I heard of them before? Jeremiah's expression darkened. Because they prefer to operate behind the scenes. They've been watching everything, the estate, Charles' death, my return. And now that they know we're working together, they're going to make their move. Ava's heart raced. What do they want? Jeremiah stopped and turned to her, his eyes filled with quiet resolve. They want the estate, all of it, and they'll stop at nothing to get it. Ava felt a surge of fear, but she quickly pushed it down. She had come too far to back down now. She wasn't about to let some shadowy figure take what was hers, or what Jeremiah's family rightfully deserved. What do we do? She asked, her voice steady, despite the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. Jeremiah's gaze hardened. We fight, but we need to be smart about it. We need to gather more information, find out who they are and what they're planning. Only then can we stop them. Ava nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle over her. The battle for the estate was far from over, and the stakes had just been raised. But she wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. As the days passed, Ava and Jeremiah began working together, a tenuous alliance forming between them. They needed to uncover who was behind this hidden threat, the rival family seeking to take control of the estate. Ava had never dealt with anything like this before. Sure, she'd faced business rivals, but this was different. This was personal. Jeremiah had been tracking movements around the estate for weeks, small things that didn't seem like accidents. A car parked a little too long down the street, unfamiliar faces watching the property from a distance. It all added up to something larger, and now they were in the crosshairs. One morning, as Ava sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Jeremiah. "We need to meet. There's something you need to see." Her heart skipped a beat. What now? Ava quickly grabbed her things and made her way to the estate's security office, where Jeremiah was waiting. He was standing over a row of security camera feeds, his face tight with focus. "I've been reviewing footage from the past week," Jeremiah began. "There's been someone lurking around the property after dark. Look at this." He rewound the footage and pointed to the screen. A figure moved in the shadows near the old wing of the house, staying out of sight but clearly watching the estate. Ava's stomach twisted in fear. "Who is that?" she whispered. "I don't know," Jeremiah replied. "But they've been coming here for several nights. They know the layout of the property, they know the blind spots in the cameras, and they're watching for a reason." Ava's mind raced. She felt a rush of anxiety, but also anger. "We have to stop them. We need to figure out who they are and what they want." Jeremiah nodded, his eyes dark with determination. "I have a contact who can help us. He's an investigator, someone I trust. He's been looking into this rival branch of the Brooks family for years." Ava frowned. "Why haven't you mentioned him before?" Jeremiah shrugged. "Because I wasn't sure if we needed him. But now, things are getting more dangerous. I think it's time we brought him in." Ava agreed, though she couldn't help but feel uneasy. Who was this investigator, and how deep did the rival family's connections go? That night, as Ava lay in bed, she heard something outside. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable. Her heart pounded in her chest. Someone was out there, and they were getting closer. The next day, Jeremiah introduced Ava to his contact, a sharp and no-nonsense investigator named Henry Lawson. Henry had a long history with both the Brooks and Monroe families, and he knew more about their tangled past than anyone else. They met in the estate's library, where Henry laid out files and photos on the table. Ava watched him carefully, unsure of what to expect. Henry had the look of someone who'd seen too much. His eyes were hardened, his movements deliberate. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I've been investigating the rival branch of the Brooks family for years," Henry began, his voice gravelly. "They've been waiting for the right moment to take back the estate. Jeremiah and I suspected something like this would happen after Charles died, but now it's clear. They're making their move." Ava leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. "Who are they?" Henry glanced at Jeremiah before continuing. "The leader of this rival group is a man named Edward Brooks. He's a distant cousin of Jeremiah, but he's ruthless. He's been involved in several shady dealings, all aimed at gaining control of the Brooks' original holdings, including this estate." Ava's pulse quickened. "What does he want?" "Power," Henry said simply. "Edward believes that the Monroe family stole the estate from his ancestors, and he's made it his mission to get it back, by any means necessary. He's been quietly buying up properties around the estate, and now that he knows you and Jeremiah are working together, he's getting desperate." Ava's mind raced. Desperate men made dangerous decisions. "So, what's our next move?" Henry leaned in, his eyes locking onto hers. "We need leverage, something that will force Edward to back off. If we don't find it, this will only escalate." Ava nodded, but doubt gnawed at her. How could they find leverage over someone like Edward Brooks? He sounded like a man who wouldn't be easily intimidated. Henry's voice broke through her thoughts. "There's a file, an old one, that Charles mentioned before he died. He told Jeremiah that it contained information about the Brooks family, something that could shift the balance of power. If we can find that file, it might be the key to stopping Edward." Ava's heart pounded as Henry's words sank in. A file? Hidden somewhere on the estate? She looked at Jeremiah, who nodded grimly. "We need to find it, Ava, before it's too late." The search for the mysterious file began immediately. Ava, Jeremiah, and Henry scoured the estate, from the main house to the old wing, looking for any sign of where Charles might have hidden such an important document. The estate was vast, filled with countless nooks and crannies, secret drawers, and hidden compartments. It was overwhelming. Ava felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. Charles had kept so many secrets, secrets that could save or destroy everything. Why hadn't he trusted her with this? As the days went on, they found nothing. Frustration built with each passing hour, but Ava refused to give up. She couldn't let Edward Brooks win. She couldn't let him take away everything Charles had built and everything Jeremiah's family had once owned. Then, one afternoon, while searching the attic, Ava stumbled upon something strange. It was an old, ornate chest, tucked away behind a pile of boxes. It didn't look like it had been touched in years, covered in dust and cobwebs. Her heart raced as she knelt down and opened it. Inside, she found a stack of documents, carefully bound together. Her hands trembled as she picked them up and began to read. These weren't just any documents. They were legal papers, old deeds and contracts, dating back to the original ownership of the estate. And there, tucked between the pages, was a letter from Charles. Ava's breath caught in her throat as she read his words. The letter was addressed to her, written just weeks before his death. In it, Charles explained everything: his plan to restore the Brooks family's legacy, his regret for not telling her sooner, and his fear that Edward Brooks would try to take the estate by force. But there was more. Charles had uncovered a secret about Edward, one that could ruin him if it ever came to light. Ava's hands shook as she held the letter. This was the leverage they needed. But now that they had it, how would Edward react when he found out? Armed with the file and Charles's letter, Ava and Jeremiah prepared for the final showdown with Edward Brooks. They knew they couldn't wait any longer. Edward was closing in, and if they didn't act soon, he would make his move. Henry arranged a meeting with Edward, setting the stage for a confrontation that would determine the future of the estate. Ava felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach as they prepared for the meeting. She had never faced someone as ruthless as Edward before, and the thought of it terrified her. But she couldn't show weakness. Not now. The meeting took place at a neutral location, an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a cold, gray day, the kind of day that made everything feel more ominous. Ava, Jeremiah, and Henry arrived first, waiting in tense silence for Edward to show up. When he finally arrived, Ava was struck by how ordinary he looked. Edward Brooks was a tall, thin man with sharp features and cold eyes. He moved with a quiet confidence, the kind of man who was used to getting what he wanted. "Jeremiah," Edward said, his voice low and smooth. "I was wondering when you'd finally make a move." Jeremiah didn't flinch. "You've been playing this game for too long, Edward. It's over." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Is it? I don't think you understand what's at stake here. This estate belongs to me. It always has." Ava stepped forward, her voice steady. "You're wrong, and we have the proof." She handed Edward the file, watching as his face shifted from curiosity to rage. As he read through the documents, the color drained from his face. Charles had uncovered more than just old deeds. He had found evidence of Edward's illegal dealings, enough to destroy him. Edward's hands shook as he looked up at Ava. "You think this will stop me?" "Yes," Ava said firmly. "Because if you don't back off, I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done. This estate doesn't belong to you, and it never will." Edward's eyes darkened, and for a moment Ava wondered if he would lash out. But then he smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a chill down her spine. "You may have won this round," he said quietly, "but this isn't over. Not by a long shot." With Edward temporarily out of the picture, Ava and Jeremiah breathed a sigh of relief. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but they both knew that Edward wasn't finished. He would return, and next time he would come with a vengeance. But for now, they had what they needed to secure the estate. Ava worked with her lawyers to finalize the legal transfer of the property, restoring part of the land to the Brooks family as Charles had intended. It wasn't an easy process, but it was the right thing to do. As the weeks passed, the estate began to change. The renovations Jeremiah had planned were put into motion, breathing new life into the old property. The partnership between Ava and Jeremiah grew stronger, their shared goal bringing them closer together. Yet, despite the progress, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. Charles's death, Edward's looming presence, and the secrets that had been uncovered weighed heavily on her. There was still unfinished business. One day, as Ava walked through the restored gardens of the estate, Jeremiah approached her with a serious look on his face. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Something I've been meaning to tell you." Ava's heart skipped a beat. What now? What more could there be? Jeremiah hesitated for a moment before speaking. "It's about Charles. There's something you need to know about how he really died." Ava felt her breath catch as Jeremiah's words sank in. Something about how Charles really died? She hadn't allowed herself to fully question the details of Charles's sudden death. It had been labeled an accident, and she had clung to that explanation, unwilling to believe anything more sinister. But now, Jeremiah's somber tone told her there was more to the story, something she needed to know, even if it would change everything. "What are you talking about, Jeremiah?" Ava asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you know about Charles' death?" Jeremiah took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to reveal. "There were signs, Ava, things that didn't add up. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure if you were ready to hear it, but after everything that's happened with Edward and the estate, I can't keep it from you anymore." Ava's heart pounded in her chest as she braced herself for the truth. "Tell me." Jeremiah gestured for her to follow him, and they walked to a quiet corner of the estate, away from the workers and the renovations. He looked around, making sure no one was within earshot before speaking. "The night Charles died, he and I had been going over the final details of the estate transfer," Jeremiah began. "He had everything ready, the legal documents, the contracts, everything needed to finalize the return of the land to my family. But he was worried." "Worried? About what?" Ava asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "About Edward," Jeremiah said quietly. Charles knew that Edward wouldn't let the transfer happen without a fight. He suspected that Edward had been watching him, trying to sabotage the process. That night, Charles told me he was going to confront Edward, try to reason with him one last time. Ava felt her blood run cold. "You're saying Charles met with Edward before he died?" Jeremiah nodded. "Yes. They met at the old warehouse near the edge of town. Charles wanted to try one last time to make peace, to convince Edward to step aside." Ava's stomach churned. She knew what Jeremiah was implying, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. Instead, she let him continue. "When Charles didn't return that night, I knew something was wrong," Jeremiah said. "I went looking for him the next morning, and that's when I found out about the accident. But I never believed it was just an accident." Ava's legs felt weak, and she sank onto a nearby bench. "You think Edward had something to do with Charles' death?" Jeremiah hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I don't have proof, but I've always suspected it. Edward had the motive, and he had the means. He's done worse to people who've stood in his way." Ava's mind raced. It was hard enough to accept that Charles had kept secrets from her, but the possibility that his death had been the result of foul play was almost too much to bear. She felt a surge of anger and grief all at once. "But why would Edward kill him? Couldn't they have come to some kind of agreement?" she asked, grasping for answers. "Edward doesn't make deals, Ava," Jeremiah said, his voice firm. "He takes what he wants, and he destroys anyone who stands in his way. Charles was a threat to his plans for the estate, and that's all Edward needed to justify getting rid of him." Ava shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "This can't be true. Charles didn't deserve this." "No, he didn't," Jeremiah said softly. "But if Edward was behind it, we need to find proof. We need to hold him accountable." Ava wiped away her tears. her sorrow giving way to a burning sense of determination. "Then we'll find the proof, Jeremiah. We'll bring Edward down for what he did." In the days that followed, Ava and Jeremiah dove headfirst into uncovering the truth about Charles's death. They began retracing Charles' final steps, reviewing old security footage, and interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something on the night of his death. It was a painstaking process, but they refused to give up. Ava's emotions swung between grief and rage. The more she learned about Edward's ruthless nature, the more convinced she became that he had played a role in Charles's death. But without hard evidence, they had little to go on. One night, as Ava was sorting through old files in the estate's library, she came across something unexpected, a letter addressed to Charles, dated just a week before his death. The letter was brief but chilling. It was from Edward. Ava's hands trembled as she read the words. "Charles, I've warned you time and again to stay out of my business. If you persist in meddling with the estate, there will be consequences. I won't say it again." Ava's heart raced as she clutched the letter. This was it. This was the threat that proved Edward had a motive to harm Charles. But it still wasn't enough. They needed more. She quickly called Jeremiah, her voice urgent. "I found something. A letter from Edward to Charles. He threatened him." Jeremiah arrived at the estate within minutes, and Ava showed him the letter. He read it carefully, his expression darkening. "This is exactly what I feared. Edward's threats were real." "We have to confront him," Ava said, her voice filled with resolve. "We can't let him get away with this." Jeremiah nodded, but he looked wary. "Confronting Edward isn't going to be easy. He's not the kind of man who backs down. We need to be prepared for anything." Ava took a deep breath, her determination unwavering. "Then we'll be ready. I'm not afraid of him, Jeremiah. Not anymore." The stage was set for a final confrontation between Ava, Jeremiah, and Edward. They arranged a meeting at the same warehouse where Charles had met his tragic fate. Ava's heart raced as she and Jeremiah drove there, the tension thick in the air. She had never been more nervous in her life, but she knew this was the moment where everything would be decided. When they arrived, Edward was already there, waiting. His cold eyes locked onto them as they stepped out of the car. "Ava, Jeremiah," Edward said with a mocking smile, "I was wondering when you'd finally come to your senses." Ava's jaw clenched. "This ends today, Edward. We know what you did to Charles." Edward's expression darkened. "You don't know anything." "We know enough," Jeremiah said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "Charles confronted you about the estate and you threatened him. We have proof." Edward's smirk returned. "A little letter? Is that all you've got? That's hardly enough to prove anything." Ava stepped forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "Maybe not, but it's enough to make you sweat. And we're not stopping until we bring you down." Edward's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Ava saw a flicker of fear. "You think you can win this? You don't know who you're dealing with." Jeremiah remained calm, but Ava could feel the tension in the air. Edward was dangerous, and they were pushing him to his limits. "We're not afraid of you," Ava said, her voice steady. "Charles may be gone, but his legacy isn't. You won't take this estate from us." Edward's face twisted into a sneer. "You're making a mistake, Ava. A big one." As Edward's hand slipped into his coat pocket, Ava's heart raced. What was he reaching for? Was this about to turn deadly? The air was thick with tension as Edward's hand hovered inside his coat pocket. Ava's pulse quickened, her instincts screaming that something was about to happen. Jeremiah moved slightly in front of her, ready for anything. But instead of a weapon, Edward pulled out a phone. He held it up, his smirk returning. "You thought you had me cornered, didn't you? But I always have a backup plan." Ava's confusion deepened. What was he talking about? Before she could ask, Edward pressed a button on his phone, and within seconds, a new car pulled up outside the warehouse. The doors opened and two men stepped out, both large, intimidating figures dressed in black suits. They moved toward Edward, their faces emotionless. "You see," Edward said calmly, "I don't fight my battles alone. I've made powerful friends over the years, people who are more than willing to help me get what I want, and what I want is for you two to disappear." Ava's heart pounded. This wasn't just about the estate anymore. Edward was willing to go to any lengths to silence them. "Don't do this, Edward," Jeremiah warned. "It doesn't have to end like this." But Edward's eyes were cold. "It already has." The two men moved closer, and Ava's mind raced. How were they going to get out of this? And what would Edward do if they couldn't stop him? As the two men advanced, Ava's pulse quickened, her thoughts racing for a way out. Edward stood behind them, his cold smile betraying the danger they were now in. But Ava wasn't about to let fear paralyze her. She glanced at Jeremiah, who subtly motioned toward the exit. He had noticed a side door that could be their escape route. Ava gave him a barely perceptible nod, her mind working on a plan. Just as the two men moved to grab them, Ava threw the letter from Edward onto the ground. "You want to keep this quiet, Edward? Do you really want this proof floating around?" Edward's eyes flickered with uncertainty for the first time. "That letter is worthless." "Maybe," Ava said, stepping back toward the side door. "But it's enough to ruin your reputation. It's enough to make people question you, and I have more copies, hidden safely where you'll never find them." Edward's face darkened. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Ava countered, her voice firm. "Do you want to risk it?" Edward paused, uncertainty clouding his features. Ava seized the moment. "Jeremiah," she whispered. In a flash, Jeremiah grabbed her arm, and they dashed toward the side door. The two men lunged, but Jeremiah was faster, slamming the door shut behind them. They sprinted to the car, Ava's heart pounding as they drove off into the night. Edward's final shout echoed in the distance. "You won't win this, Ava! I'll be back!" But as the car sped away, Ava knew Edward's threats were hollow. They had the evidence, the leverage, and the truth on their side. They were safe, at least for now. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of legal battles, media coverage, and public confrontations. Armed with the letter and other evidence they'd uncovered, Ava and Jeremiah worked with their legal team to expose Edward's dark past. Edward's powerful connections and threats were no match for the tide of public opinion. His reputation was destroyed, and the legal system finally caught up to him. He was forced to relinquish all claims to the estate, and the truth about Charles' death began to circulate. While there was no hard proof to charge Edward with Charles' murder, the court of public opinion condemned him. The estate was secured, with a portion of it legally restored to Jeremiah and the Brooks family. Ava's name was cleared, and together they began to rebuild the estate with integrity, as Charles had intended. Standing on the balcony of the estate, Ava gazed out at the rolling hills and carefully restored gardens. The weight of the past had finally lifted. She had found justice for Charles and helped restore the Brooks family's legacy. More than that, she had learned that wealth wasn't in property or power, but in truth, community, and doing what was right. Jeremiah joined her, standing by her side as they surveyed the land they now shared. "It's been a long journey," he said quietly. Ava nodded. "But we've made it. Together." She took a deep breath, the air crisp with the scent of freshly bloomed flowers. "This estate is more than just a piece of land. It's a part of our story now, and we're going to write the next chapter together." Ava's journey from entitlement and blindness to discovery, justice, and community shows that no matter how dark the secrets of the past may be, the truth always has a way of coming to light. Together with Jeremiah, they fought against injustice, restored their family legacies, and found peace in the truth. The story ends with hope for a brighter, more unified future. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful tales of redemption, justice, and unexpected twists. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that the truth always finds a way. We have more incredible stories coming, so hit that notification bell to stay tuned for what's next. Thank you for watching.